I'd like to read some excerpts from one of the later chapters in which Jack has some of his most incredible adventures. And the chapter is written in Jack's voice. As I now saw it, Belaine was a tropical frontier town, crawling with unsavory creatures that crept out from under their rocks whenever they smelled potential. One colony of contrabandistas was squirming around me. It seemed we shared a common interest. They also hated Jerry Green. Jerry had committed the unforgivable act of betrayal. He had violated the code of honor among thieves. The bandits, who were definitely capable of more than just carrying stolen goods across the border, swapped stories about Green at a dark corner table in their favorite cafe, a plain, dingy, open storefront with white walls and a gritty black and white mosaic floor. I listened to them boast about their exploits, sly smiles twisting across their tanned faces, mouths pinched on cigarettes, eyes squinting against the smoke, stopping now and then for Damada to translate. Each crook tried to outdo the other. Some tales rose to the level of Ripley's Believe It or Not. As I listened to one story after another, I was surprised to feel a kinship with these barbarians. Other times, I found myself wondering what the hell I was doing in a mangy cafe in a South American border town, an American family man, surrounded by a crafty pack of thieves, swapping stories about a common adversary. The contrabandistas took it upon themselves to punish Green in their own way. They sipped cappuccino with Ronaldo and me at their favorite table in their favorite cafe while they worked on a plan. We would band together and get Green. Everyone would be satisfied. They would get their revenge. I would get my money. The crooks heard, I suspected from Alberto, that Green was staying at Alberto's house in town. It was time to act. They would pick me up at the motel that night at 9. We would get Green. The night was brutally hot. At 9 o'clock, I walked through the damp, clinging air left by an evening storm and climbed into the back of an old black Brazilian Ford. The short trip from my room had raised a mustache of sweat. I recognized the driver from the cafe downtown, but the other man in front was a stranger. They grunted "Boa noite," good evening. The car headed toward the main road. It felt like 120 degrees inside and reeked of sweat. I moved to open a window, and the stranger turned to watch me. His eyes were cold and opaque, like a dead animal's. My chest vibrated in time with my heart. I grinned stupidly at the man. "Hot night." The man's laugh was like a truck on a bumpy road. I slowly opened the window and leaned back in my seat. The burly thug turned back around. He and the driver had a brief conversation that ended with the kind of laughter that follows a dirty joke. It occurred to me that this might be my last ride. Allegiances in this part of the world, especially in this circle of humanity, were as fragile as straws in the wind. I wished earnestly that I had my .45. If we turned right at the end of the road toward town, I could keep on breathing. If we turned left toward the jungle, I'd better say my prayers. My shirt was soaked. In what seemed like slow motion, the car turned right. I released a slow, silent whistle. Nobody spoke. The air from the window was as hot as the inside air. I mopped my forehead with my handkerchief. I looked at my watch and wondered if it had stopped. The 15-minute ride to town seemed endless. We came to an unfamiliar section of Belaine. The dilapidated shacks and warehouses with broken windows did nothing to calm my fear. A man lay motionless on the sidewalk. I couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. The car slowed as it approached a set of iron gates next to a small wooden booth. Nearby, clumps of weeds wound through a rusty barbed wire fence. A sign with an official emblem hung over the gate. It said, "Prisão do Brasil," Federal Prison. The driver honked the horn, turned off the motor, and lit a cigarette. The other man leaned back and put a foot on the dashboard. I thought seriously of bolting, but this neighborhood looked savage. Long minutes ticked by. Finally, two men built like wrestlers, wearing filthy prison orange shirts and pants, sauntered through the gate. The driver started the engine. The men got in the back seat, one on each side of me. The stench of dirty hair and unwashed bodies fouled the stagnant air. I breathed in short gulps. The gorilla's massive limbs pressed against me from both sides, hard as watermelons, hot as fire. This must be hell. My new friend in the front seat turned around and raised one side of his mouth in an evil smile. He pointed to one of the convicts. "Homicidio," he said smugly. He pointed to the other brute and held up two fingers. "Dos homicidios." My fear expanded. Murderers? Two stinking murderers? I must have been freaking insane to team up with these bastards. The double murderer had an irritating habit of noisily clearing his throat and spitting huge, thick mucus balls out the window. Every time he leaned and took aim, his sweaty leg pressed harder against mine. The jailbirds acted as if they were on a joyride, talking and laughing with the men in front. I guess they were discussing how they would use me to amuse themselves. Would I see dawn? After about 15 minutes, we came to Alberto's townhouse, and the mood changed. I felt the convicts' ham hocks turn rigid. The car rolled down the hill, engine off, and stopped behind another car full of men, out of sight of the armed guards patrolling Alberto's grounds. Everybody got out. Nobody spoke. I recognized some of the men in the other car from the cafe. Ronaldo was there, looking grave and anxious. Our driver opened the trunk to reveal a small arsenal, pistols, Uzis, and 2 Browning 12-gauge automatic shotguns. Quietly, he handed a weapon to each man. I got a .38 automatic revolver. I held it in my hands and stared at it. It was a substantial piece of metal. Dread filled my limbs. The hot silence was broken by the cold, metallic claps of shotguns cracking open and shells loaded, barrels spinning in revolvers, and clips ramming into Uzi's receivers. Dogs in the neighborhood started barking. The men scattered, taking cover behind trees, cars, and bushes as they ran toward Adalberto's house. I looked for a place to hide. My legs worked in jerky robotic motions. Silently, the men surrounded the yard. Some took shelter near the thick stucco-coated walls that circled the property. If and when Green appeared, he'd be at their mercy. I pressed myself against a tree, and I will leave the rest for your reading pleasure.